It's also my story, right? So this word map was on my wall next to the phone for about a decade. We were in Windsor Fifth Ward in North Orem and raised our children there. And it was a really great experience until it kind of wasn't. And we aren't alone, right? This is a national trend. Pew Research talks about the rise of the nuns. N-O-N-E, the people, when you ask them what religion they are, they say nun. And then there's another researcher that distinguishes between the nuns and the duns, so the people that used to be religious. He's got a good book called Dun, Daryl Van Tongeren. So this is becoming enough of a phenomenon that we're starting to get some research in the clinical literature about what this experience is like. So this is what I studied for my capstone, and want to share the high points with you about what, if you've gone to some of the post-religious groups you would, or listen to podcasts, you would kind of understand the story intuitively, as well as like how it may or may not have happened to you. But we're getting official research about what this experience looks like for people. So what is this like, right? According to the research, so the research that we have now is just emerging. It's the qualitative phenomenological research, and that just means a fancy way of saying, asking a bunch of people what their experience is in an open-ended way, and then the themes of what their experience is arises out of their stories. And so one researcher called leaving religion or deconversion is kind of the term that's in the literature, a unique form of psychoexistential trauma. One thing that I wanted to highlight was that this is described as non-volitional, which means it doesn't feel like a choice. So the process was unwanted and resisted, and when people realized they had lost their faith, that was a realization, it wasn't a decision. And so that is kind of an important thing for you to, especially if that describes your experience, is an important thing to own when you communicate with believing friends and family. This tends to be a gradual cumulative process. It doesn't happen all at once. They describe what they call punctuating events, followed by dormant periods, and this can take years to go through. So what triggers a faith transition? Cognitive dissonance tends to be what it is. So this is mental discomfort that comes from holding conflicting beliefs. There's a contradiction between what you believe or value and what the group believes and values. So for example, in the LDS context, a lot of times this looks like I was taught that Joseph Smith was righteous, but then I learned more about non-polygamy, for example, or I learned that being gay was wicked, but I'm really close to my gay brother. He's a great guy. But it tends to not just be one thing, right? If it was just one thing, like questioning everything you've ever been taught is really expensive, it turns out. And so if it's a choice between this one thing and everything else, you're going to find a way to explain the one thing. So polygamy was for the widows, for example. So and then so things stack up. So this is where you get the broken shelf analogy, right? So things stack up until the shelf breaks. And at that point, the usual taken for granted foundations of everyday life, everyday assumptions and practices vanishes. And there's a sense of groundlessness and unreality. So for me, it felt like falling down the rabbit hole. There's this Weird Al song that played in my head for years. Everything you know is wrong. And yeah. So at that point, what does this look like emotionally? So yeah, there's a lot of negative emotions to go through, it turns out, and often we aren't really trained in how to deal with negative emotions because in the religious system, negative emotions meant you weren't righteous. So but here you've got a lot of negative emotions to go through anyway. So there's a fear of judgment, fear of rejection. You were part of this community, and the way I felt it was I was in the us versus them system, and I had been an us, and all of a sudden now I'm a them, and that was really destabilizing. Betrayal, that's a big one, and anger. Existential anxiety, so worries about meaning, purpose, and death. And a lot of losses. So what losses, you ask? So there's, you lose a secure sense of the afterlife. You lose a pre-made moral compass. You lose social support and community, and an all-encompassing sense of meaning. Now, these are going to map out really well onto some of the existential therapy themes. So the themes in existential therapy are death, freedom, choice, and responsibility, isolation, and meaninglessness. And we're going to talk about that in the second part of the presentation. There's an identity crisis, so that's similar to trauma. So the group told you who you were, and so now after you've got to figure out who you are without the group. And so there's kind of a sense of a second adolescence of like experimenting and trying things on and seeing what feels organic to you and what doesn't. But if you can get through all of this bad or difficult stuff over a long period of time, people tend to get to a place of thriving. This personal development, self-discovery, changes in existential values, so changes in ideas about meaning and death, and seeing new possibilities after you mourn the loss, increased confidence and empowerment and relief, a transformed sense of self, so that identity gets rebuilt, and freedom, authenticity, and peace. So, as John DeLynn puts it, the gift of a Mormon faith crisis is the rest of your life. This feels kind of like a hero's journey to me when I look at it, right? And I don't want to like make it a bigger than what is big, right? And it's also a grief journey, right? You're losing something, and you have to embrace all the emotions that go along with it. And as you do, you can see new possibilities as you do so. Okay, so shifting gears to existential therapy. So I'm in my first term of my graduate program, and in this methods class, we have a unit on existential therapy, and I was like, what? Why didn't I know about this when I was going through my faith transition? Why aren't the ex-Mormons talking about this? So that's basically why I'm doing this presentation, is trying to get the word out that if you're going through this, you don't like have to reinvent the wheel. Other smart people have thought about this and have written about it, and if you're worried about this, you don't have to feel worried about this. So Yalom, so existential therapy rises out of existential philosophy, which is basically scholars figuring out over the last 100 years how to get along mentally without God. How do we figure this out? And so anyway, in Yalom was one of the Americans that translated the existential philosophy ideas into therapy. So it's basically looking these four ultimate concerns in the face and seeing how you deal with that, how you cope with that. So death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness. And if you are worried about these, they're part of the human condition. When we try to push these anxieties out of awareness, that tends to lead to worse outcomes. But if you confront them in a healthy way, that's ultimately healing. And it turns out that religions do a really good job of providing existential comfort, right? I think especially Mormonism, right? We do this really well. So, like, we have this very defined afterlife. If you're worried about, like, what kind of choices are right to make, we have these commandments that unambiguously define what's right and wrong. If you keep the commandments, you'll be safe and happy. Isolation, so close-knit communities are encouraged. You've got your word, you're kind of encouraged to build your own family, which is its own kind of community. And there's also this interpersonal sense of connection. So if you feel like you're alone, you can feel like you're connected to the Holy Spirit or God, that you're not alone, and then meaning, right? If you want to know the meaning of life, invite the missionaries over and they will tell you in about an hour. And it's unambiguously and confidently defined. And then meaning is also acted through everyday choices, right? You can feel meaning as you serve your community. These beliefs act like a warm blanket that protects from this icy chill of some of these existential concerns. And I believe I think there's some evidence to support why this is part of why religions evolved, is to help us be more functional in the face of some of these anxieties. So, if you read the CES letter, and in the space of an afternoon, you lose your faith, and that blanket gets ripped away, this is a really destabilizing experience. So to face those without the structures or preparation or gradual exposures to help acclimatize. So now we'll dig into the existential concerns. So death is kind of goes about saying that Barbie shuts down the party by thinking about dying, and yeah, that's kind of what shuts down the party for us. This is terrifying to think about. So when people leave religion, sometimes you need to remourn previous losses, whether that's people, or for me, I'm a cancer survivor, and I'm celebrating 20 years after the diagnosis. And so, like, I had to mourn like the loss of some body parts, right? I had the belief that there would be a resurrection, that would be restored. So, but we have evidence to support that when people, cancer survivors will like report that they can like build a better life for having stared at this reality. That when we know how this ends, we're more motivated to live well now, rather than just assuming that there's going to be an eternal life. Freedom, choice, and responsibility. So freedom sounds like this great thing, and it is, and it's kind of overwhelming and terrifying. So when we know that we're going to die, that motivates us to make the most of our lives here, but there's so many choices. The choices are overwhelming, and every commitment we make cuts off other possibilities. So if you marry one person, you can't marry the other people. And they have consequences, right? It affects ourselves, it affects the people we love, it affects the world, and that's frightening too. And so when people lose their identity and their worldview in a faith transition, it makes it difficult to know how to make new choices, because all the bases that you made choices on before have changed. Existential isolation. We've got Don Draper here from Mad Men, who kind of had a rough upbringing. This idea that we all are born alone and die alone, and we can't fully understand each other's experiences at 100% deep level, and sometimes it's hard to connect with people. And yeah, in the research it showed that in one of the studies, every single one of the people, when they lost their religion, it ruptured their relationships. So this is a concern that happens for people in faith transitions. And the sense of meaninglessness of there's not like a clear, unambiguous, self-evident meaning of life. And so there's a sense of the void, of like absurdity, or especially for us Mormons, the grand meaning that we previously had. And so in existential philosophy, they kind of talk about building your own meaning. And I like to think of it in kind of small ways, right? Whether I've got my work and my family, and kind of building it piece by piece like that has been a helpful idea for me. And so existential therapy is kind of about confronting human to human some of these basic conditions, and not looking away, and normalizing, validating that these are, if this is a thing that worries you, this is part of the worry, and in the hope that something good comes out of that confrontation. And I believe it does. So how can people heal and rebuild after a faith transition? Kind of using some of these ideas. So grieving the losses, right? Going through those negative emotions and feeling sad, right? Being willing to go through that. Gradually facing some of those existential fears. Kind of not in an overwhelming kind of a way, but looking at some of those things that come up for you. Reclaiming agency, so that this is that freedom and choice piece. Is, feeling where you want to, where you're. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought here. But making choices where you can, and kind of feeling into those that feel good and organic to you. rebuilding meaning. So for me, this, like I said, this has been a lot of like putting small pieces together. And so for me, I had a bit of an existential depression when I was like 19, and then I was worried it would happen in my bigger faith transition when I was like 40, and it kind of didn't happen. And I think it was a difference in the way my life was set up. I had meaningful work, and I had my children to raise, and I think some of the confrontation with cancer had helped. And so I kind of waited for that existential depression to come, and it kind of didn't. And I think it was just the way my life was set up at that time. Rebuilding identity, so experimenting and making new commitments when it makes sense, and kind of rebuilding who you are. Rebuilding community, right? This is part of why we're here today. And as we do so, we can return to this sense of authenticity and aliveness and peace. And this is a big, if you talk to people who've been on this path, it takes a long time to do, right? This is not an overnight process. So not everybody feels existential anxiety, and that's okay. It's probably good not to, right? It's not, but if you do, it's not a flaw. That's a normal human response, right? So it seems like, and this is kind of my intuitive sense of things, that so people will have more or less existential anxiety depending on their personality types. It seems like there's some people that kind of like to know the top-down meaning of things, like to go way into depth, like to kind of know the meaning of things, and that leads to more, I think. Also, I think trauma has a thing to do with this, how your life is set up, how easy it is it for you to connect with people, right? And the kind of people who can just kind of be here now, be present, and don't worry, be happy. I think they're kind of wired to have less existential anxiety. And then this is normal to feel when you're in the space of a life transition. That's people normally feel more existential anxiety then. One reason why I wanted to bring this up is because occasionally existential ideas aren't in therapy. So that kind of maybe your average CBT therapist that maybe on the younger side hasn't had to deal with some of these anxieties that maybe sometimes come up as people get older. Sometimes it gets misdiagnosed as depression, anxiety, or suicidality. Maybe that's not what it is, right? So if you're here and you're looking for therapy, and not everybody needs therapy, right? But if you are, it's important to find somebody who can be validating to where you are and not necessarily pathologize this. And my hope is that we can use some of these ideas to get to a place of thriving, right? And I've got some resources for people. So the Urban Yalom has written a bunch of books for lay people, and this is one, Staring at the Sun, is specifically about death anxiety. Brittany Hartley's work is really great, and I guess she's working on a book right now about the void, and this book that she's on TikTok and YouTube, No Nonsense Spirituality, and this book here is about building rituals and things like that to kind of build spirituality in your life without religion. And I think, yeah, that's it for me. Yes?
Do we need spirituality? Is spirituality the only answer for these existential questions?
So that's a good question. So spirituality, and I had my own journey with this word spirituality because it has a Mormon meaning and it has a general meaning. And as I understand it, the general meaning is about questions of meaning and purpose and connection. And so if you retranslate, and I get the trial response to the Mormon meaning of feeling connected, that God's telling you what to do, or at least that's how it felt for me. And so I kind of had to retranslate that word in my head going through my graduate program. Given that, I feel like if you define spirituality in the way of meaning and connection, then I feel like that's more universal, and it doesn't have to be mystical.
I was associating it with mysticism and crystals.
Yes. No, that's not what we heard about it, Grace. So, although Mark, that's okay too. Any other questions? Yeah, Jenny.
Well, I was just going to say, I always see my spirituality making connections and building those relationships. Is what I consider, because that's my connection to the universe, is people.
Yeah, Jeff.
You kind of hinted to this, or talked about this a bit, but I have noticed that the existential dread really hits hard with young adults. Like my kids all went through it when they left. I went through it, but I had a basis of, like, I know things will get better because they've always gotten better in my life.
Yeah.
What do you recommend for kids and young adults when they're going through that existential dread, or what for parents that are watching these kids go through that? What would you recommend for them?
That's a good question. As I understand it, it's not just our kids, right? I feel like this is a Gen Z thing overall, as our institutions have gotten weaker, and that kind of overlaid some of these things where people didn't have to reinvent the wheel themselves. And I feel like that's why, like, Rick Hartley's success on TikTok really, really took off. And I'm sure the pandemic didn't help. And how to help, I'd love to have a conversation about that. But I feel like maybe talking about some of these ideas, and like the idea of building meaning and maybe experimenting to build meaning, right? That you can like test out a little experiment and see if this feels organic and meaningful, and then building on that, and just kind of normalize that this is a part of this stage of life, like normalizing it. But if you guys have other ideas, I'm sure you guys do. Yes.
I kind of think it actually goes back to spirituality and connection with other people. Does Gen Z or whatever generation it is that's having an existential crisis feel connected, feel meaningful outside of themselves, or are they just overwhelmed but unconnected because they are so screen oriented? Even when teenagers are together, they are often all looking down on their screens watching something rather than actually having a connection with other people around them. So I think that's just maybe exacerbating.
Right, no, I think that's part of it, right? We're wired to be social creatures and connect with each other, and when we do, that gives us so much calming, right? This co-regulation, attachment, and when we struggle with that, or whether that's different personality types or different generations, or as different generations have had different experiences, it can be that can lead to some of this anxiety, right, as a symptom. Yes.
One of the things that I have found myself recognizing was a precious gift. Even though I was raised in the LDS church or faith, my parents had always said things like, you will know something is true or a prophet is true, saying something when you know from within yourself. And that I didn't realize till I was grown and experiencing life, that I was not accepting that this was the only pathway, the beliefs that were being shared with me. So I really appreciate that the question had come up about, do we need spirituality? And I will chime in here. I've always separated religion and spirituality as completely different, because spirituality to me is a personal pathway. But it was interesting in the beginning. You were giving some background on your background with the LDS culture, and you said a line, I meant to remember it. It was like, as you accepted the beliefs being taught, the beliefs you were taught in the beginning. It was something like about the beliefs, and I thought, isn't it interesting? How do we mature to the point that we understand that we have to come to terms with beliefs ourselves, that we have to figure out how we're going to deal with that? And I really appreciate I'm not trying to make a proclamation here, other than I have found my way to peace is truly through connection with all creation, all humanity. You know, it's like, how do you create connection? So Utah Valley Oasis is doing that. You know,
Yeah,
the Oasis
exactly.
program is doing that. But
Exactly.
but there's so many ways you can do that. So are you finding, Sarah, that in your practice, as this awareness has grown for the done or the known within a religious practice of any sort, what are you seeing comes to the forefront that is really stabilizing for people?
I feel like there's no shortcut for like stabilizing, right? It takes time to organically build something authentic, you know. But I feel like a lot of it is connection with people, right? We're built to connect with people, and that's what we're about. And I'm glad that you're able to find that authentic differentiation between your own internal experience and the religion, and it worked a little different for me. But, yeah, but we're all different, and that's what's cool about these stories. Okay, one last question here, Rich.
Yeah, I'm just wondering about shifting in place. I dumped Buddhism, and I think it was a mistake. Because all I really needed to do was accept the stories as stories rather than as truth. And I could have kept my friends, kept my ritual, kept alive. Now maybe Mormonism is so black and white that it's very difficult to do it for you guys. But I just feel personally I could have shifted in place, and I think I might try and go back and do that. Your comments?
Oh, no, that sounds like a really healthy system that would let you shift in place. Sorry, I think our time is up here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was amazing. I think we probably all go through existential crisis a couple times in our life about different things, and those solutions and thoughts are relevant to lots of different existential crises.